August 2022, 29-year-old Lily Lindsay strode out of a nail salon in Aberdeenshire, Scotland, feeling especially polished. Usually, she did her own nails with an at-home gel manicure kit, but today, she'd gotten her nails done at a fancy salon, and she had even paid extra for eyebrow threading. Lily had really spent a lot of money over the past week to make herself as beautiful as possible. Her best friend's wedding was in 2 days, and Lily really wanted to look absolutely perfect for the photos. To Lily, looking her absolute best was another way of showing her friend how excited she was for her big day. Lily ran through a short mental checklist of everything she still had to get done before the wedding. She needed to pick up her dress from the tailor and get decorations and snacks for the bridal suite. But before she could do any of that, she had one more appointment. She was getting a facial. Lily decided to grab an iced coffee on her way to the spa. She walked a few doors down from the nail salon to a little cafe on the corner. And as she walked in, she caught a glimpse of herself in the store window, and she couldn't help but smile, because she was beautiful and elegant, and so she could barely wait to see how amazing she would look with her full hair done and makeup and her dress on. It had been hectic helping her best friend bring the wedding together, but she could not be more excited for the weekend ahead. The wedding would end up being even more incredible than Lily had hoped, and she had really high expectations. And 10 days later, Lily still felt like she was recovering from it. She stumbled from her bed to her bathroom, stretching her arms high overhead to try and wake up. She yawned, and she could feel the skin around her mouth start to crack a bit, which seemed strange for summertime. Her skin had not felt this tight and dry since midwinter, when the cold and high winds left her whole face feeling chapped. Lily went to grab her toothbrush, but when she saw herself in the mirror, she stopped. The skin under her eyes was blotchy and red. She leaned in toward the mirror for a better look and traced the outline of the rash with one of her fingers. She'd never had a skin outbreak like this before. Lily opened up her medicine cabinet and looked at the array of skincare products inside. She'd used most of the products for months or even years, but now she wondered if maybe she'd developed an allergic reaction to one of them. So she decided to skip her skincare routine for a few days to see if maybe that would clear up the irritated skin. But Lily's rash didn't get any better. And after 2 weeks of eliminating different face products to see if that helped, she found herself on an examination table at a doctor's office. At this point, she'd stopped using every face serum she owned, but still had not been able to identify what was making her skin break out. In the last few days, her rash had spread across her face and down her neck. The red splotches itched and would sting if she tried to cover them with makeup, so she had to leave the rashes exposed, which made her sort of embarrassed in public. Lily winced as the doctor gently tapped his finger all along her rash. He was being very gentle, but still it burned every time he touched her, almost like salt touching a wound. The doctor stood up and told her not to worry. He'd seen cases like this a dozen times. It was standard-issue dermatitis, which meant a skin irritation, usually caused by an environmental factor like air pollution or exposure to a new allergen. He was confident that an antibiotic would clear her face up in no time. Lily was so relieved. She'd never had particularly sensitive skin, so she was surprised to learn that all of this boiled down to skin irritation, but she was just glad to have a diagnosis and a plan of action. She told the doctor she'd stop at the pharmacy on the way home and grab the antibiotic. A month after Lily's initial visit to her doctor, she was in her room getting ready for a follow-up appointment. She carefully peeled off her pajamas and put on wide-leg jeans and a baggy shirt. These were unfortunately the only clothes she could stand to wear these days, because the rest of her wardrobe fit too snugly and rubbed against her raw skin, which was still totally broken out and incredibly painful. The antibiotics had not worked. Her skin still felt crusty, her lips were so dry that they split every time she laughed. Big blotchy rashes covered her face and neck, as well as down her chest and beneath her armpits. They were so painful that Lily often tried to keep her arms raised slightly whenever she walked around, usually with her hands on her hips to avoid chafing. Showering had also become excruciatingly painful. She'd started skipping it as much as she could, which made her feel totally dirty. As Lily walked out the door this time, she hoped this appointment would finally lead her to some answers. She didn't know how much more skin irritation she could take. 30 minutes later, Lily parked her car at the doctor's office and made her way across the parking lot, keeping the hood of her jacket over her head to obscure her face. She knew it was superficial, but she still felt embarrassed to let people see all her blotchy and flaky skin. As Lily checked in with the receptionist and headed into an exam room, she tried not to make eye contact with anybody in the office. As she changed into a hospital gown, she thought how repulsed people would be if they saw her undressed. When the doctor finally entered the exam room a few minutes later, his eyes widened a bit, and Lily knew he was shocked by her appearance. He quickly recovered and acted totally professional, but Lily couldn't help feeling totally ashamed as he asked her about the rash and inspected it on different areas of her body. After a few minutes, the doctor told her that, in his opinion, this seemed like a flare-up of eczema, which is a term for chronically inflamed skin. It's like an extreme case of dermatitis, which is what he'd originally diagnosed her with. But antibiotics don't work against eczema, which is why she was not improving. But he told her not to panic because a steroid cream would clear it up in no time. A few months later, in January of 2023, Lily sat on her couch as a winter storm raged outside. The steroid cream had also not worked. If anything, it only seemed to make her breakout worse. At this point, her skin, in total, was actually more rash than clear. Lily had spent the last few months going to all sorts of doctors. They were all sympathetic to her problem, but ultimately had been unable to help her. It was unbelievably frustrating. Lily felt trapped in her own skin, like she was in a cage she couldn't escape. In fact, Lily's skin troubles had gotten so bad, it was totally affecting her mental health. Her thoughts were starting to get really dark and pessimistic, so she'd gone to a therapist for help. The therapist had prescribed her a low dose of antidepressants, which were helping with some of Lily's racing thoughts and feelings of hopelessness, but they were obviously not a cure for the entire situation she was in. At this point, even if she felt mentally okay, physically she was in so much pain all the time that she couldn't even leave the sofa. So tonight, Lily had wrapped herself in a fuzzy blanket, the only one that didn't scratch at her skin, and ordered herself a pizza. Lily decided to watch a movie, but when she got up to grab the remote, she felt blood rushing to her head and her vision began spinning. Lily eased back onto the couch and closed her eyes, feeling so dizzy it made her nauseous. Then suddenly her ears began to ring, and her chest tightened as she tried to fight back anxious tears. She knew that dizziness and ear ringing were not symptoms of eczema, and so she couldn't help but start wondering if she was actually going to die. This was the final straw. Lily could not just sit around and wait for death, and if the doctors couldn't help, she would just have to solve this puzzle herself. So she slowly got up and very painfully walked over to grab her laptop because now it was time for her to conduct her own research. A few hours later, Lily was crouched over her computer, poring over an article she'd found online. It discussed the symptoms of extreme allergic reactions, and to Lily's surprise, many of her symptoms fit. This entire ordeal really did seem like one big allergic reaction. But Lily still had no idea what she might be allergic to. So she started looking up common allergies, until she found a couple that sounded like hers. She discovered that some people are actually extremely allergic to the latex from the balloons that she had actually used during her friend's wedding to create custom arrangements. Now, Lily had never had a problem with latex before, but the article said that allergies could develop later in life. She also found that home nail polish kits, like the ones she used, can cause allergies too, as the chemicals seep into people's bodies through the nail bed. Lily started thinking that surely there must be a way to test whether these chemicals were making her break out so horribly. And so for the first time in 5 months, Lily felt like she kind of had a plan here, and so hope began to spark inside of her. She would call her doctor first thing in the morning, and hopefully they could, together, get to the bottom of this thing once and for all. A few days later, on a Friday afternoon, Lily sat on an allergist's examination table with her hands on her knees. She was wearing a hospital gown, and her rash-covered back was fully exposed. She winced as her doctor taped a bunch of small patches to her back. To Lily, the patches looked like little strips of bubble wrap, but actually, they were allergy patch test strips, and each of the little bubbles contained a different allergen. Lily clenched her jaw. The strips were already beginning to itch, partially because they were stuck to her rash, which was sensitive already, and partially because they'd stuck more than 200 chemical samples to her back, including latex and the chemicals from her at-home nail kit. So she was bound to be allergic to at least a few of these things. When the doctor finished his work, he explained to Lily that unfortunately, she would have to leave all of these test strips on her back all weekend, no matter how much they irritated her. She nodded, though she was absolutely dreading the discomfort the next few days would bring. But she told herself that if she could just push through to Monday, she would almost certainly have an answer, and then this nightmare could finally be over. By Monday morning, when Lily drove her car into the doctor's office parking lot, she wanted to rip those test strips off her back and light them on fire. It had been the most miserable weekend of her life. The only thing that had gotten her through the very itchy discomfort was knowing that each little sting she was feeling was a positive reaction to an allergen and a possible answer to her problems. As she strode into the doctor's office, her clothes billowed all around her because she could only wear really baggy clothes, and there were bags under her eyes because she hadn't slept well either, so she was quite the sight. But Lily prayed that it would all be over soon, because in a few short minutes, she would know exactly what was causing this excruciating rash. Except that's not what happened. Lily's doctor peeled off all the patches and explained that he could only see a few mild allergic reactions, but nothing that could cause a reaction this bad all over her body. Lily couldn't understand. Her symptoms had matched an extreme allergic reaction perfectly, especially to latex or the at-home nail gel. She was so sure she was on the right track, and now she just felt defeated. Lily drove home in a stupor. She felt like her life was now this living hell. She thought back to the previous summer, mad at herself for not appreciating how good her life used to be. She'd give anything to go back to the day of her best friend's wedding and just look like her old self again. She ran her tongue over the veneers she'd gotten for the wedding. Her smile was the only part of her physical appearance that she liked now, but she would give it up in a second to get her old skin back. But just then, a thought hit her like a lightning bolt, and she actually pulled her car over so quickly that the tires screeched. Once she came to a stop, she immediately began rifling through her purse for her phone, and as her heart raced, she thought to herself she'd been going to the wrong doctor. That was the issue, and now she desperately needed to make an appointment with the right one. 2 days later, Lily sat in her dentist chair. She told him that in her quest to look perfect for her friend's wedding, she suspected that she had accidentally set herself up for months of misery. She was just sure she had discovered the cause of her extreme rash. When the dentist looked skeptical, Lily told him about the article she'd found online about extreme allergies. And suddenly, the dentist understood too. Lily had a strong suspicion that her problems had all been caused by the gels in her at-home nail kit. But it was more complicated than that. In fact, the online article Lily read talked about the way nail gels can make people dangerously allergic to other everyday things. That's because the acrylic-based plastic in the gel can seep into someone's nail bed and make them allergic to anything else that contains acrylic. In Lily's case, that would be the veneers she had applied to her teeth to look beautiful for the wedding. The veneers were loaded with acrylic-based plastic, and her body had a very powerful reaction to it. Essentially, Lily had poison glued to her front teeth for the last 6 months, which triggered a constant, severe allergic reaction. Ultimately, the dentist ground the veneers off of Lily's teeth in April of 2023, and slowly but surely, the rash became less painful. By the summer of 2023, Lily's skin was back to normal, and she felt like herself again. There's really no way to know for sure whether the at-home gel manicure kit had triggered her allergy, but either way, Lily has steered clear of them ever since. Here is our second and final story called No Warning. On the morning of August 15th, 2020, 16-year-old Rohan Gadhania stood in his kitchen mixing up a protein shake. He was trying to put on some muscle before school started in a few weeks. Rohan took a sip and grimaced. The shake was thick and chalky, which he just was not expecting because he did not often drink protein shakes. But Rohan was never one to back down from a challenge, so he adjusted his glasses and steeled himself, then gulped the whole shake down. When he was done, he slammed the glass down on the counter in triumph. He told himself he was going to learn to like those shakes because he was going to get jacked. Rohan put the dirty glass in the dishwasher, then bounded up the stairs to his bedroom on the second floor, already feeling stronger. In truth, he was a very skinny kid, especially for his age. And even though Rohan knew he had a lot going for him, good grades, a bright future, a very winning personality, he really wanted big muscles, or at least to weigh more than a 12-year-old. Rohan opened the door to his bedroom and made a beeline for his piano keyboard. Rohan was a very accomplished musician and loved practicing just about every day. But this morning, he stopped himself and instead turned toward the Nintendo Wii game system hooked up to the television on top of his dresser. He grabbed the Wii remote and began browsing through Wii Fit games until he came to strength training. Rohan thought that if he started right now and kept on sucking down those protein shakes, maybe he really could build some actual muscle by the time classes resumed. At lunchtime, Rohan's father, Hitendra, made sandwiches for the two of them and then called Rohan to the kitchen table. But while Hitendra wolfed his meal down in about 4 bites, he noticed that his son barely touched his food. Rohan told him his stomach hurt, and Hitendra just nodded, understanding. He told his son it was fine if he didn't want to finish his lunch, and encouraged Rohan to go lie down and take a nap. Hopefully that would settle his stomach. Rohan smiled at his father and then left the kitchen. Once the boy was gone, Hitendra picked up Rohan's plate and began to tidy up. But then he heard the distinct sound of dry heaving coming from the upstairs bathroom. Hitendra dropped the plates into the sink and hurried upstairs to check on Rohan, who he found kneeling over the toilet. Rohan retched repeatedly as his father rubbed his back reassuringly. Then Hitendra suggested Rohan stay in bed for the rest of the day. It seemed like he must have picked up some kind of stomach bug. Once Rohan was in his bed with a waste can nearby just in case, Hitendra went back downstairs and found the protein powder he'd gotten for Rohan. It was the only unusual thing Rohan had eaten over the past couple of days, and Hitendra wondered if it had gone bad or had some strange ingredients in it. Hitendra scanned the label, and he saw the expiration date was not for a while, and none of the ingredients stood out to him as unusual or alarming, so he shrugged and put the protein powder back where it went in the cupboard, convinced his son would feel better by morning. But when Hitendra went to check on Rohan the next morning, the boy was as white as a sheet. Rohan admitted he'd vomited a few times overnight, and that he felt even worse than the day before. The boy propped himself up in bed, squinting. Hitendra thought his son might be looking for his glasses, so Hitendra told Rohan they were on the nightstand. Rohan nodded slowly, but then he started looking around the room as if he didn't know where to find his own nightstand. Hitendra frowned and just pointed at the nightstand, and Rohan's face suddenly lit up as though he was pleasantly surprised to even find a table there. Now, Hitendra couldn't help but feel more concern for his son. He wondered if Rohan was so dehydrated that he was confused. So he helped Rohan downstairs and sat him at the kitchen table while he went to grab a bottle of the sports drink they always kept in the pantry. But when Hitendra returned to the kitchen carrying his son's drink, his son suddenly seemed even stranger. Rohan glared at his father with utter contempt. When Hitendra asked if everything was okay, Rohan snapped that his father should mind his own business. Then Rohan got up so aggressively that the table shook. Then Rohan just stood there staring icily at his father. This was very unlike Rohan, and so Hitendra knew something had to be deeply wrong. Rohan was so gentle normally, but now he was erratic and aggressive and confused. Hitendra knew his son needed to see a doctor, but something told him it was just not safe to try to take Rohan to the hospital by himself right now, like not in this state, something was terribly wrong. So to play it very safe, Hitendra just called an ambulance. A few hours later, Rohan's mother, Pushpa, arrived at West Middlesex Hospital, where the paramedics had taken her son. She kept telling herself that Rohan would be just fine, but Pushpa still felt incredibly anxious as she entered the hospital lobby. Her husband, Hitendra, met her in the hallway outside of Rohan's room and explained that Rohan had become increasingly agitated on his way to the hospital, and he kept trying to get up and move around the ambulance on the way, and Hitendra actually had to physically restrain him on the stretcher to keep him from jumping out the back doors. Pushpa just blinked in surprise at this incredibly strange turn of events. Rohan was just not the type of boy to fly into a rage, let alone leap out of a moving vehicle, and so fear began creeping into Pushpa's mind, much the way it had already creeped into Hitendra's mind. And so Pushpa followed Hitendra into Rohan's hospital room, hoping to find Rohan back to himself and feeling better, but instead, Rohan was sitting up in bed, hunched over a kidney-shaped bowl and vomiting. Pushpa felt instant sympathy for her son as she watched him throw up, but that wasn't the worst of it. There were tubes hooked up to Rohan's arms, and wires patched to his chest, leading to all sorts of whirring and beeping machines. Whatever was wrong with Rohan was clearly more serious than just the flu or some other minor ailment. Pushpa looked back at Hitendra, whose eyes were full of concern. Hitendra explained that Rohan had been deteriorating ever since they arrived at the hospital, and the doctors still had no idea what was making Rohan sick. Rohan was complaining of intense abdominal pain and kept forgetting where he was or how he'd even gotten there. Suddenly, the knot in Pushpa's chest tightened and her breathing quickened as she grappled with what Hitendra was saying. And so, kind of panicking, she just stepped out into the hallway and let out a scream of absolute despair. Her son was falling apart before her eyes, and there wasn't anything she could do. She felt so hopeless. Pushpa bent over and braced her hands on her knees, sucking in long breaths of air. When she finally felt like she had collected herself, she went back into the hospital room and planted a kiss on Rohan's forehead. She told her son everything was going to be fine, even though inside she didn't know that. Then she stood next to Hitendra, gripping his hand tightly. Over the next few hours, Pushpa and Hitendra paced the hospital room as their son alternated between moments of confusion and extreme agitation. All the while, doctors and nurses came in and out, explaining all the tests and treatments they were doing to try to figure out what was wrong. The doctors said that they suspected that Rohan was suffering from some kind of inflammation around the spinal column and brain, and so they started him on medication right away for the two most likely conditions, which were meningitis and encephalopathy. For a little while, Rohan did seem to get better with the medication. But just before midnight, he started to get restless and agitated again, and he began trying to jump out of the bed, which would have torn out all the wires and IV lines. And so Hitendra did his best to hold the teenager down, while Pushpa repeatedly pressed the call button for help. A moment later, two nurses were in Rohan's room, attaching restraints to Rohan's wrists so that he couldn't get out of bed. A doctor said that Rohan was getting too unstable to remain in a regular hospital room, and he directed the nurses to move him to the intensive care unit. Pushpa was shocked. She knew Rohan was sick, but she still couldn't believe his condition had gotten this bad, and so she had to fight to hold in another scream. The nurse said that Rohan would be sedated once he got upstairs, and he would likely be asleep for hours. She urged Pushpa and Hitendra to go home for the night and then come back rested in the morning. Pushpa hated the idea of leaving her son, but she also knew that he'd be under close watch in the ICU without them. And if Rohan was going to be in the hospital for a few days, she and Hitendra would need some sleep. So they followed the medical team to the ICU, and they stayed with their son until he fell asleep, and then after kissing their boy goodnight, the parents headed home. When they got there, Pushpa threw on some pajamas and crawled into bed, but she felt like she was not going to be able to sleep. She just stared at the ceiling, thinking of her son, and she would lay there, her thoughts racing, until about 5 a.m., when her phone started ringing. It was the hospital. The doctor explained that Rohan's condition had actually taken another serious turn for the worse over the night. Rohan was now struggling so hard to breathe that he had to be intubated and put on a ventilator, which meant that a machine was now keeping him alive. Absolutely shocked and terrified, Pushpa shook Hitendra awake, and then she ran to wake up their 17-year-old daughter, Alicia, and then the three of them threw on their shoes and raced to the hospital. By the time they arrived, Rohan's doctor was there to meet them. The doctor admitted that they were struggling to get Rohan stabilized, but he was not actually in immediate danger. Once he was stable, they planned to do another CT scan so they'd have a better picture of what was going on in his brain. Pushpa felt like she was going to faint, so she sank into one of the chairs that lined the pale blue hallway of the ICU. She was vaguely aware that Hitendra and Alicia had sat down on either side of her, and each had taken one of her hands. After the doctor left, Hitendra squeezed Pushpa's hand and reminded her that while all of this sounded terrifying, Rohan was in good hands here. Pushpa wanted to believe that, but the drumbeat of bad news over and over and over again was making it hard for her to be optimistic. Pushpa sat tensely by Rohan's bed for the entire day, willing her boy to get better. Rohan's doctor came to check in every few hours, assuring them that Rohan would get his CT scan once he was stable enough. And then finally, in the late afternoon, technicians were able to perform that CT scan of Rohan's brain. And then, around 6 p.m., Rohan's doctor slowly walked into his room, staring at the floor. The doctor took a deep breath and looked Pushpa in the eye. He told her that Rohan had severe swelling in his brain, which can be fatal if it's not controlled. The doctor said he had already called the neurosurgery department at nearby Charing Cross Hospital, but the team there had said they could not, in good conscience, operate on Rohan to relieve the pressure. Given the extent of his brain injury and meningitis, they were not confident he would survive the surgery. Pushpa struggled to understand what the doctor was even saying, that essentially her son was too far gone to help. She hadn't even considered this possibility. Her boy was only 16 years old. Despite all her worry over the past few days, she had fully believed her son would eventually get better. He had to. Pushpa told the doctor he had to be wrong, but the look on the man's face said everything. Her boy was beyond helping. The following evening, on August 18th, Pushpa sat on the edge of Rohan's bed, her hand wrapped around his. Rohan lay motionless, still intubated and hooked up to IVs and machines. Hitendra and Rohan's sister, Alicia, sat nervously on the other side of Rohan's bed. Rohan's doctor was leaning over him, essentially checking the teen for signs of life. He stood and slowly turned to Pushpa and her family. He looked truly sad as he said that Rohan showed no brain activity. Then he said he would give them time to say their goodbyes, and he left the room. Pushpa stroked her son's hand, still unable to accept what was happening. Alicia tucked a teddy bear under Rohan's arms. He'd had it since he was a baby, and still slept with it every night in the corner of his bed. The whole family knew he'd want his bear to be with him now. For the rest of the afternoon, the family sat in silence as they struggled to say goodbye to Rohan. And then finally, at 5:03 p.m., Rohan passed away, and Pushpa's heart shattered. But her family did not get much time to grieve, only a few minutes. A doctor entered the room and asked Pushpa and Hitendra to consider donating Rohan's organs. He apologized for how quickly they'd need to make this decision, but organs need to be harvested for transplant as soon after death as possible. The doctor knew it was small consolation, but he said that Rohan's death could very likely save other lives. The doctor then held out some lengthy forms. The idea of filling out paperwork in the same hour that her young son died was repulsive to Pushpa. But she understood, and she knew what decision Rohan would have made. And so she and Hitendra took the forms and agreed to donate Rohan's organs. A few weeks later, Pushpa sat in Rohan's bedroom back at their home outside of London, holding his teddy bear to her chest. It was the only one of his belongings that she'd touched since her son had died. The grief of losing a child was almost more than she could bear, and since his death, something else had really been eating at her. Pushpa still didn't even know what had made Rohan sick, and because they had donated his organs, there hadn't been time to conduct an autopsy, and so she was really struggling to accept that she'd just never learned what had killed him. Pushpa worried that if what had killed Rohan was something genetic or environmental, his sister Alicia might also be at risk. But more than anything, she wanted to know if something could have been done to save Rohan. It just felt like this huge question mark was looming over her family's head, occupying every waking thought. 13 months after Rohan's death, so in September of 2021, Hitendra ignored Pushpa's running commentary on his wild driving as he weaved in and out of traffic. They were on the way home from Alicia's university. They'd just finished moving her into the dorms for the fall semester, which felt even more bittersweet than Hitendra had anticipated. He and Pushpa were empty nesters now, but only because Rohan was gone. Hitendra did not want to go home and cook a dinner for just 2 people. He was about to bring up the possibility of maybe going out to a restaurant when Pushpa's phone rang. It was an unknown number, but for some reason, the hair on the back of Hitendra's neck pricked up, and he told Pushpa to please answer it. And so Pushpa did, and she connected her phone to the car speaker so they could both listen. The man on the other line sounded grim. He explained that he was from the National Health Service blood and transplant team, the people who harvested their son's organs for transplant. Hitendra exchanged a quick, surprised glance with Pushpa as this man went on. The man said they needed Pushpa and Hitendra to come into the office for an urgent meeting. Hitendra was confused, but offered to drive straight to the office. They could be there within the hour. The man said that would be great and thanked them. Hitendra felt more curious than alarmed, so he pushed the gas pedal a bit faster as Pushpa reset the GPS to their new destination. What Pushpa and Hitendra learned at this meeting absolutely shocked them. The National Health Service team member explained that the recipient of Rohan's liver had become gravely ill earlier that year. A biopsy on the liver that had come from Rohan revealed a very dangerous condition with a very complicated name. It's called ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency, or OTCD for short. OTCD is a genetic condition that prevents the body from breaking down ammonia, which can cause the toxic chemical to build up to lethal levels in the bloodstream. The man explained that the recipient of Rohan's liver didn't have OTCD before his transplant surgery, so the illness had to come from the donated liver, Rohan's liver. And so the team member told the parents that their son almost certainly suffered from OTCD. Finally, 13 months after Rohan had passed away, his parents knew what had actually killed him. Pushpa and Hitendra stared at each other in disbelief. They were relieved to get some answers, but they didn't know anything about OTCD and why it would have suddenly killed Rohan like that, and so they asked for more information. The NHS team member explained that some people with OTCD don't even know they have it because the disease is inactive. However, the illness can be triggered by a big dose of protein. And in Rohan's case, he had drank a huge protein shake on the morning he got sick. He'd never consumed so much protein before so quickly, and his body basically couldn't handle it. And so that's what prompted him to get sick. Pushpa and Hitendra were obviously devastated. If they'd only known about Rohan's kind of inactive condition, they would have never let him drink protein shakes like that. Now, could that have forever prevented him from getting the disease? They don't know. But certainly, that protein shake is what prompted it. Thankfully, though, it does not seem likely that their daughter has OTCD, which affects an estimated 1,000 people in the United Kingdom alone. More studies are being conducted on OTCD, but as far as we know, it is extremely dangerous, killing about 50% of infants diagnosed with it at birth, and around 10% of people diagnosed with it when they're 16 or older, which was Rohan's age. However, there were no warnings that the protein powder that Rohan ingested could trigger this terrible disease. Rohan's experience ultimately prompted calls for new warnings to be printed on all supermarket-bought protein shakes in the UK.
Simply put, a goth is someone who finds beauty in things that most other people consider to be pretty dark. But most Americans tend to associate the term goth with the teenagers of the late 90s and early 2000s that wore all black and wore heavy black boots and would hang out in cemeteries. And while that representation of goth culture is, of course, limited, it is a good representation of the two protagonists in today's story, best friends Rachel and Molly. In the 1990s, Rachel and Molly were full-blown goths. They had black hair, black makeup, black clothes, they had the black heavy combat boots, and at one point they and their other goth friends started hanging out in a cemetery to be kind of ironic and funny, like, look at us, we're goth, we hang out in cemeteries. And then they actually enjoyed it and began hanging out in a cemetery like every weekend. One Friday night, Molly calls Rachel to go hang out in the cemetery. And as it happened, Rachel was just sitting at home and she was bored out of her mind. And so the call came at a perfect time. And so Rachel's like, yeah, I'd love to go. So she flies downstairs and she sits on her front step and she's waiting for Molly to show up. And eventually Molly's car rolls down the street and Rachel immediately recognizes that Molly is the only one in the car. And Rachel, whenever she would go to the cemetery at night with Molly, they were always there with a group of at least 4 people. Even though they liked hanging out in the cemetery, they did recognize that it was a little bit creepy at night to be out there, and so they liked kind of rolling in a fairly big group. And so Rachel hops in the car, and her first question to Molly is, where is everybody? Are they meeting us there? And Molly said, oh no, everybody else is either working or they're kind of hungover from the party from last night, so it's just us two. I hope that's okay. And at the time, Rachel actually in her head was like, no, I don't really want to do this anymore. But she was like, oh yeah, that's fine. Yeah, we'll just go. Just the two of us. It'll be fine. Molly takes off from Rachel's house and she makes the familiar kind of winding commute to the front gate of this enormous cemetery that sits right in the center of town. They drive underneath this massive wrought iron gate that looks very medieval, very foreboding. It looks like it's out of a cheesy horror movie, this like cliche entrance to a cemetery. And so they go through there and they're on this road that stretches all the way down through the cemetery and basically splits it in two. On the left side, as you're driving in, was an area closest to town, and also it butted up against a major public university. And then on this side of the cemetery, you had a bunch of residential houses that butted up against the side of the cemetery. And where Molly and Rachel and their crew liked to go was on the right side, all the way back in the corner, because there was a section that was kind of situated between these two hills, where not only were they obscured from the cemetery road and the main road once they were down in this little depression, there was also no houses that happened to look over that spot. So it was kind of like the hidden section of the cemetery. And there was also this big boulder that people sat on and a big tree you could lean up against. So that was their spot. So Molly drives in the gates, she heads down that road and she turns right onto a dead end road. She takes that down about a couple hundred meters till it dead ends and they park. And then the girls get out of the car, they light up cigarettes and they walk down this hill that's just beyond where this dead end comes to an end. And so they walk down this hill and it brings them to this clearing where this big rock and tree is. Rachel hops up on the rock and she turns around, so she's facing back up the hill they just walked down, and Molly is right next to her on her right, leaning up against the tree. And for the next hour or so, they just crushed cigarettes and talked about their various boyfriend drama and life drama and whatever else they wanted to talk about. After a while, the girls started to smell a bonfire, and from where they were sitting, they could see a hill in front of them, and there was actually another hill over here, and so their view is pretty obscured out of this little valley they're in, so they can't see any fires anywhere. And so they assumed that what they're smelling was a fire coming from the other side of the cemetery, because there's that huge university over there, and they knew sometimes the college kids would come onto the cemetery and they would light fires over there, and inevitably the police would get called and they would break up the fire because you're not allowed to have a fire on the cemetery. And whenever they did that, the police would actually make rounds around the entire cemetery, and historically, basically, if you were there hanging out, they would tell you to leave. And so they think, okay, this is probably a good time to leave, because probably in the next 30 minutes to an hour, the police are going to be here. They're going to come over here, see our car, and they're going to ask us what we're doing, and we're going to have to leave. So let's just leave now. So Rachel hops off the rock, and the two of them begin meandering their way back up the hill towards the car. When they get about halfway up the hill, they notice to their right something bright. Now, because they were higher up, they could actually see over the hill to their right, and what they were seeing was the top of a bonfire. So the girls take a couple more steps up the hill to gain some elevation to hopefully be able to see better down into where this fire is. But even when they're up almost at the top of the hill, that fire is too far down on the other side of that hill that they can't see any people, and they can't really tell how big the fire is. They're just basically seeing the top flickers of it. Even though they don't know anything about the people over there at this fire, what they do know is when they showed up, there was no fire over there. They would have recognized it. So whoever's over there had to have shown up and built this fire while Rachel and Molly were down at the rock and tree, which means there's a pretty good chance they didn't see Rachel and Molly. This is a pretty private area. Their car was parked a little bit off to the side of the trail. And so Molly picks up on this and she says to Rachel, hey, let's sneak back down and walk up their hill and look down and see who's here. I bet it's a bunch of college kids. It'll be funny to see what they're doing. But Rachel had a weird feeling about it. She's thinking to herself, if this is college kids, why would they have their bonfire this far away from campus? I mean, this is literally the farthest point away from the side of the cemetery that's close to their campus. If they're having a party over here, there's a good chance that anybody going to it is going to need to drive. And that just doesn't make sense if you can just walk to the other side of the campus and have a bonfire over there. And so Rachel is logically deducing that this is probably not college kids. But who else is having a bonfire in the secret section of the cemetery in the middle of the night? And Rachel's thinking that now if the police come here, they're definitely going to see us because we're so close to this bonfire. And so it's probably not a good idea to stick around much longer. But despite Rachel's hesitations, she is intrigued and she does want to see what's going on over there. So the two girls walk down the hill, they make it down to the rock and the tree, and they turn left and they begin walking up this other hill, the hill that's going to bring them up to this fire. And so they only get a few steps up this hill when they are suddenly hit with this disgusting, putrid smell that just encompasses them and it makes them gag, and they're covering their mouth and their nose. And Rachel exclaims, "Oh my God, what is that?" And then as soon as she says it, she realizes she was really loud. And they both freeze, wondering if the people on the other side of the hill have heard them. And after a little bit of silence, Molly's like, "You want to keep going?" And Rachel's like, "No, we gotta go." Between the horrible smell that's obviously coming from this weird fire and the fact that Rachel basically just gave them away. And so for all we know, these people on the other side of this hill have heard us and now they're waiting for us to come over the edge, and it's gonna be really awkward if we suddenly crash their bonfire. Rachel, she's thinking about these things, and so she's like, "Let's go, we gotta go." Molly's disappointed, but she gets it, and the two girls turn around and begin walking back. And so they walk past the tree and the rock on their left, they turn right, and they're about to walk up the hill that's going to bring them to their car when Rachel just turns around to look at the hill towards the fire where they were headed before. And standing at the top of that hill is a man just looking down at them. And the fire is illuminating him from behind, and they can clearly tell it's a man standing there looking at them. And immediately the girls felt really uncomfortable. It was almost like they had just been caught spying, even though they didn't actually get caught spying. It was what they were going to go do. And so they felt like they had almost been caught red-handed. And so Molly and Rachel just turn and begin walking up the hill, kind of with their heads down. They just felt kind of awkward. And so they move a few more steps up this hill, and Rachel looks again at where this guy was standing, and he's now gone. And Rachel's relieved, but then she realizes he's gone because he's power walking down the hill towards them. And Rachel gasps, and she grabs Molly and pushes her and says, "Go, go, 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 go." And they start running up the hill, and Rachel looks around, and now this guy is running towards them. He's down now at the rock and the tree. He's gaining on them. They sprint up over the top, they run to Molly's car, and Molly's fumbling with her keys to get the car open, and Rachel's yelling, "Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up!" Finally, she gets it open, and they both jump inside. Rachel locks the car doors, and as Molly is turning the key over, Rachel's looking out the back, and she's waiting to see this guy, and sure enough, as they pull off, she sees his head come up over the ridgeline, just enough that he can clearly see them leaving, and then he ducks back down and he disappears. And the two of them speed down the road, they make a left onto that main drive, and they speed out of the cemetery. For the first few minutes of their drive, neither of them say anything. This was just a very traumatic experience, and it was also very confusing because they thought they were going over to spy on college kids having a bonfire, and then they're hit with that horrible smell. Like, what was that horrible smell? And then they leave, and there's this guy who did not look like he was a college kid. He looked like he was probably in his 40s, and then he's chasing them. Like, what was that? And when they did start talking about it, they couldn't really come to any sort of rational conclusion of what had just happened. And so they were both very spooked, and they decide, let's just go home and talk about this tomorrow. And so Molly drops Rachel off at her house, and Molly goes home, and both girls go to bed. The next morning, Rachel gets up and she heads down to the kitchen where her mom is already there having her morning coffee. And Rachel sits down and, she's not a big talker. She's not about to start by saying, "Hey, guess what happened to me last night at the cemetery?" Instead, she just sits there, and for a little bit, her mom just kind of rambles about work and what she's doing that day. And then all of a sudden, her mom, it's like she has this epiphany. And she goes, Rachel, did you hear what happened last night?" And Rachel's like, "No, what?" And her mom's like, "Someone I work with. I don't know her personally, but she works in the same building as me. She got kidnapped from the parking garage where I parked my car. I have seen her park her car in this lot, and she got kidnapped." And Rachel's like, "Oh my God, really? Like, what happened to her? Did they find her?" And her mom was like, "Yeah, but it was too late. The person who had kidnapped her had killed her and then tried to dispose of her body at the cemetery by burning her in a bonfire." Rachel suddenly felt sick because now she knew what was happening last night, and she knows what that smell was. Rachel immediately pours her heart out about everything that happened the night before, and her mom is totally horrified, but she's in particular horrified that they clearly had been there when the killer had arrived and set up shop and began burning this body. They were just literally 50 meters away the whole time. And so her mom tells her, "You and Molly have to go to the police station and make a statement. They have not caught this person yet. You've seen this person, you gotta tell them." And so Rachel calls Molly and breaks the news about what was actually happening the night before and who was actually chasing them to their car, and says, "We have to go to the police station." And so they agree, they go down to the police station and they tell them what happened, but they didn't get a great look at him. They could only say that he was maybe in his 40s and maybe average height. And so the police wrote it all down, but they basically said, "Look, if you can think of more details, we would love to hear those because this isn't really enough to go on." And so the girls go back home and they're thinking to themselves, did he see us? Does he know that we saw him? Do you think he knows that we know he's a killer now? And so they're freaking out. But luckily, within 48 hours, the police actually caught this guy because he was driving around in the murder victim's car and someone spotted him. They pulled him over and he confessed. And so he went to jail. Needless to say, Rachel and Molly thanked their lucky stars that when they started ascending that hill and they were hit with that smell, that Rachel said, "Let's not go any farther. Let's leave." Because had they continued and gone to the other side, they could have wound up in the bonfire too. Our next story is called The Raptor. In June of 2015, 45-year-old James Young landed his dream job. For the last several years, James had been a 5th grade teacher in East Canton, Ohio, teaching special education. And while he loved his job and he loved the kids he worked with, he had always had his eye on becoming a guidance counselor for high school students. In 1988, James had actually graduated from East Canton, Ohio High School, and ever since his graduation, he had wanted to come back to the school and help the next generation of East Canton students prepare for their lives as adults, and a guidance counselor was designed to do just that. James had applied for the job before, but every time he applied, they would tell him that while he was qualified, there just wasn't a spot open for him. However, at the end of that school year, he was told a guidance counselor spot had opened up at the high school and the job was his if he wanted it. And so, of course, James said, "Yes, I'll take the job." And immediately he told his mother about this amazing news. And his mother, who lived only a block away from him in East Canton, Ohio, would say that her son was so ecstatic about the job that normally when summer break was coming up, he would really look forward to that time off from school. But now that he had this new job to look forward to, he was already anxious for the summer to be over. James was a single man, but he was not lonely. He had a number of very close, lifelong friends that he would spend virtually all of his off time with. And that summer, he did just that. He went out with his friends, they explored all of Ohio and outside surrounding areas, they spent a lot of time outside, and they enjoyed each other's company. Towards the end of the summer, James and his friends knew it was time to schedule their annual trip to Cedar Point. Cedar Point is an amusement park about 2 hours northwest of East Canton, Ohio. It's situated right on the shores of Lake Erie, and it's known for its incredible roller coasters, of which they had 17, making them the park with the second most roller coasters in the world. Every summer since James could remember, he and his very close friends would make a trip out to Cedar Point, usually at the end of the summer to kind of cap off their vacation. After looking at their calendar, they decided that the best day to go would be Thursday, August 13th. This would give the group of friends one more fun thing to do before the following week James started his new job. So on the morning of that Thursday, the friends piled into a car and they made the 2-hour commute up to Cedar Point. And as soon as they got there, they went inside, they grabbed a map, and they began systematically hitting as many rides as they possibly could. And so by 4:30 p.m., they were totally exhausted. They'd been on virtually every ride. And so they were about to call it a day when James and his friends decide, hey, let's go on one more ride before we pack it in. And so they pull out their map and they're looking, and they realize they haven't gone on one of their favorite rides. It was called the Raptor. The Raptor was not Cedar Point's biggest roller coaster, but it was their fastest. It would reach a top speed of 57 miles per hour. Passengers are seated 4 across with their feet dangling below them in these suspended chairs with the big harness that comes down. And then once the ride starts, they're brought slowly up this 137-foot hill. And then at the top, they pause before being dropped down into this nearly 4,000-foot long track that spins them upside down 6 different times. So James and his friends, they closed up their map and they ran their way over to the Raptor. They got in line, and by 4:50 p.m., they had made it to the front of the line. They got into their seats, their harness came down, and then the ride started. And they were pulled up to the top of the hill. They paused, and then they were launched down the track. And for 2 minutes, they zipped and zagged and looped-de-looped all through this track. And then it was just suddenly over. And the friends had a great time on the ride. Except James realized about halfway through the ride, when they were upside down, his phone and wallet had come out of his pockets, and he actually saw them fall down towards the ground. And although he didn't see exactly where they landed, he had a pretty good idea of where they were. And so after they got off the ride, the friends were kind of talking about how much fun it was. And James said to them, hey, I lost my cell phone and wallet. Will you guys come with me while I go look for them? And so the friends agreed. They left the Raptor station and they walked down the paved path until they were in front of this fence that said no trespassing. And so James gets up to the fence and he's looking inside of this fenced-in area, and he sees right in the middle of this restricted area is his phone and his wallet. And before James's friends could tell him not to do this, he had climbed over the fence and entered into this restricted area. He ran over to his phone and his wallet, he picked it up, and then when he stood back up again, the next wave of Raptor riders came blazing through the area, and the underside, the steel underside of the ride, hit James right in the back of the head. He never saw it coming. It threw him forward, he landed on his face, and immediately the park officials saw this happen. They stopped the ride, but the riders on board the Raptor, they didn't know what was going on. And so they're stopped on the ride, they're looking down and they hear people screaming, and they look down and they see there's this man, James, lying face down on the ground with blood pooling around his head. The fence James had climbed over was there specifically to keep visitors from getting too close to this one low point in the Raptor ride where the ride can come through and it can hit you. And so medical workers, they rush over, they hop over the fence, they get to James, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead at the scene. That day, Cedar Point was put under investigation for James's death, but after reviewing the footage and talking to witnesses, the investigation was closed and they determined that the park was not at fault. James, despite being a very intelligent and sensible man, had a brief lapse in judgment, and it unfortunately cost him his life. Today, Cedar Point is still open for business, and the Raptor ride is still operational. The next and final story of today's episode is called Siren. On the morning of Monday, February 6th, 2017, a group of 7 friends who were all college-aged and living in New Zealand began packing up their cars and getting ready to drive back to Auckland, the biggest city in New Zealand. The night before, the group had been out on Lake Tiki-Tapu for a big concert called Flocella, where audience members would listen to the music while floating around on big blow-up rafts and floats. After the concert had ended, the group of friends had left the lake and headed to a nearby relative's house where they had a quiet after-party with a couple of drinks, and then everyone went to bed a little bit after midnight. This morning, the group had gotten up early because they wanted to get on the road as soon as possible to try to beat the holiday traffic that was sure to crop up that day on the way back to Auckland. February 6th is a big national holiday in New Zealand. It's called Waitangi Day, and it's to commemorate the initial signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, which is considered to be the founding document of the country. But right as the 7 friends had finished packing up their 3 cars and were getting ready to begin their 3-hour drive north to Auckland, one of the friends, a 21-year-old named Rachel de Jong, suggested they take a quick detour before they head back home. Rachel, along with another girl in this group of friends named Maddie, had several months earlier discovered this secret swimming spot that was located only about 15 minutes away from where they were now, and it happened to be on the way back to Auckland. This swimming spot was this beautiful green-blue pool of fairly deep water that was located in the middle of a forest. This pool was actually a part of the Waikato River. However, this stretch of the river where the pool was either very shallow or dry most of the time. So as a result, this pool actually looked like a standalone body of water. While there was no official trail that led through the forest to this pool of water, there was an unofficial trail. It was basically a dirt trail that cut through the woods that had formed over the years of locals tromping their way to this pool of water. After hearing Rachel's suggestion, the group of friends all agreed that this sounded like a great idea. And so the group piled into their 3 cars, and then by around 11:40 a.m., Rachel and Maddie had directed the convoy all the way to the start of this unofficial dirt trail, which was located right on the side of a winding main road. After pulling their cars safely off to the side of the road, the group got out, and then Rachel and Maddie led them to the start of this trail, and they began walking through the forest. 15 minutes later, at 11:55 a.m., the group was getting very close to the water because the trees up ahead were starting to thin out. But also at 11:55 a.m., the group suddenly stopped because from somewhere out in the forest, way off in front of them, came this loud, shrill siren sound. And it went on for nearly 20 or 30 seconds, and then it just came to a stop. And the group kind of looked around at each other. No one knew what to make of the siren, and so eventually they just kind of shrugged it off and kept on walking. Within a minute of that siren sound coming to an end, the group had made it to the end of this unofficial dirt track, which placed them at the edge of this beautiful overlook down to the pool they were going to swim in. And so they began one by one climbing down the rocks in front of them, where there were some ropes that had been put up to help people climb down to the water. And so after they got down to the water, all of them stripped down to their bathing suits, they jumped into the pool, and they began swimming out towards the center of the pool, where there were these 2 big rocks that jutted up out of the water, almost like miniature islands. And so Rachel and the other women, so 5 of them, they climbed onto one of the rocks, and the 2 men who were part of this group climbed onto the other rock. And so they got up onto these rocks and they're looking around, taking in the sights, and then at 11:58 a.m., another siren blasts across the forest. It's the same sound as the one they heard 3 minutes earlier when they were on the dirt track. And so once again, all 7 of them are kind of looking at each other, wondering what is this siren about? But after the 20 or 30 second long siren came to an end, they glanced around them and there was no sign of any danger. There was no sign of really anything happening at all. It was just this beautiful, peaceful seeming oasis. And so before long, they had forgotten about the siren again, and Rachel had gotten out her camera and she was taking pictures, and others were taking pictures as well. And then 2 minutes later, at 12 p.m., the siren sounded for a 3rd time. Now, at this point, the group has heard the siren 2 other times. And even though the sound of the siren was kind of jarring because it was so high-pitched and shrill and really cut into their ears, this time, because they've heard it 2 other times and nothing happened, they all pretty much immediately wrote it off. So the siren's sounding for the 3rd time, and the group is not really paying attention. But when the siren finally stops this 3rd time, something very different began to happen, and the group immediately noticed it. When the 3rd siren came to a stop, the friends started to hear a new sound.
and it was coming from the same direction the Siren had been coming from, which in effect was upstream. Even though this river was basically dry, they could turn and look uphill, and they could clearly see where the river would go if it was full. And so the friends turn and look upstream, and they're listening to this really loud kind of smashing sound that's coming from that direction, and they're exchanging curious looks at each other, trying to figure out what that sound could be, and then all of a sudden, they see it. A white wall of water comes crashing around the corner and began barreling straight down the riverbed towards them. By the time the friends had even processed what they were seeing, the water had reached the pool they were in, and it was flooding the pool so quickly, they could literally see this huge pool rising. Its water levels were going up and up and up all around them. And so as the rocks they're standing on began to slowly submerge under all this rising water, the group collectively decided that this can't go on for very long. Whatever this is, it's gonna stop, so just stay put, stay on these rocks, we're gonna be okay. However, within seconds, the rocks they were on were completely submerged, and the water was still tumbling down the hill towards their pool, and then spilling out over the other side down the other end of the riverbed. And they're thinking to themselves, if we don't get off these rocks soon, we're going to get swept downstream with this water. And so the two men who were on their own rock, they leapt to a rocky outcropping that was slightly higher up and was connected back up to the forest. And so this rocky outcropping represented safety. And so once they were up there, they turned around and they yelled to the 5 women still stranded on their rock to try to swim over to them, and the guys would grab them and pull them to safety. But by this point, the girls are looking around, the water's up to their knees, and it's rushing past them. They can barely keep their balance. They know if they attempt to swim in this water, they're going to immediately be taken downstream with it. And so the group very quickly decides their only choice is for the women to literally jump and grab the men who have their arms outstretched for them. And so Rachel DeJong, she was the first one to try this. She leaps off the rock, she grabs the guy's arms, and she gets pulled to safety. And then she turns around, and she and the other 2 men continue to get the women to jump off the rock to them. And at first, it's going fairly well until they get down to the second to last woman who leaps. She grabs one of the guy's arms, and then both of them lose their footing, and the guy and the woman, they both get swept away downstream. They're gone. Rachel stays calm, and she moves to the position where the guy had been who just got swept away, and she takes out her GoPro camera selfie stick, and she extends it out to the last woman who's out on the rock. Her name is Alice. And she tells Alice, jump and grab the selfie stick. And so Alice, who's almost completely submerged in water now, makes this frantic jump to grab onto the selfie stick. She grabs it for a second, but then loses her grip, and she begins being swept away. And Rachel, who at this point was completely safe, immediately jumped into the rapids after Alice. She grabbed Alice, she attempted to turn around and grab the rock to stop them, but she couldn't get a grip. And she and Alice were also swept downstream out of view. 2 weeks before Rachel, Maddie, Alice, and the others had gone to this secret swimming spot, a warning sign, like a physical warning sign that warned people not to go near this river, don't go near this pool, was stolen. And that warning sign was normally placed at the very beginning of that unofficial dirt track that the 7 friends took to get to the pool. Meaning, when the 7 friends got out of their cars and began hiking into the forest to go to this pool, they would not have understood the danger of where they were going. Now, it is true that Rachel and Maddie had previously discovered this swim spot several months earlier. However, it seems like they had just learned that this swim spot existed and how to get to it. It did not seem like they had literally walked this trail and gotten to the pool, and so very likely they would not have known about the dangers this place posed. The pool of water they were swimming in was not actually dangerous itself. It was only dangerous because the pool was located in the middle of a spill zone. About 650 feet upstream of the pool they were swimming in is a dam, and 3 to 4 times a day, they open their gates, releasing 20,000 gallons of water per second down this mostly dry riverbed, and the water comes careening across that pool all the way to the bottom. The gates stay open for about 15 minutes, and the only reason this is done is for the spectacle of it. It's to show tourists what this riverbed looked like before the dam was built. And what this riverbed looked like before the dam was built was a raging rapid. On February 6th, 2017, the dam was set to spill at 12 p.m.
So those sirens the friends heard at 11:55, 11:58, and then 12 were all warnings that a spill was about to occur. But of course, the 7 friends had no idea. After the 12 p.m. spill had finally ended, the 3 friends who had made it to the rocky outcropping and had not been swept away by the current went looking for the 4 other friends who had been swept away, and they would find them. 3 had miraculously survived, but 1 had not. The sole fatality was 21-year-old Rachel DeJong, whose idea it was to come and swim at this spot in the first place. Rachel also was the woman who had left safety and jumped back into the rapids to attempt to save her friend Alice. Today, there are many more warning signs and fences that have been put up around the Waikato River to prevent people from getting too close, because the dam still, despite the fatality, spills several times a day. However, despite all these precautions and all the notoriety around Rachel's death, people still today sneak in and go swimming in that secret pool.